This is the USALI Speaker Series. I'm Jose Alvarez, and today we're very privileged to have David Malone. So David Malone has a very well-known biography, and I've introduced him so many times that this time I actually turned to Wikipedia just to see how accurate or inaccurate they are. And so they describe David as a, quote, career diplomat. That's about right, but that's all they say. He's Canada's ambassador to the UN, has been in the past Canada's high commissioner to India, non-resident ambassador to Bhutan and Nepal, and he has written about all of those things before he became a renowned UN figure in UN circles. He was the president of what was then called the International Peace Academy, now the International Peace Institute. He took up his current position as UN Undersecretary General and rector of the UN University, which is headquartered in Tokyo, Japan. But most important to all of this, he's been an adjunct professor and now senior fellow here at NYU. Professor Malone and I have taught the UN course, which he wrote literally the book on. The students, some of them are in the room, have tired of your hypotheticals in the law and practice of the UN, now in its second edition. Other books that he's produced, the UN Security Council in the 21st Century, Nepal in Transition from Civil War to Fragile Peace, the International Struggle over Iraq, Politics at the UN Security Council from 1980 to 2005, the UN Security Council from the Cold War to the 21st century, and that's excluding the books that he's written, for example, on Haiti, which he has taken a great interest in as he visited as part of UN delegations. And he wrote a book on decision-making in the UN Security Council, The Case of Haiti. And he's written extensively on India's international relations, which is one of the topics for today's talk, including a book, Does the Elephant Dance? Contemporary Indian Foreign Policy. He obviously has a knack for titles that I lack. So just to set up what this is about, most of our audience, if they've been reading the papers, knows that Ukraine and Russia's actions there have resulted in a considerable soul searching among UN members and scholars about the future of the UN. Large numbers of UN members have supported the US-led efforts to impose sanctions on Russia, but of course not through the Security Council. Also actions to condemn the invasion of Ukraine at the General Assembly, to suspend Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council, again through the General Assembly to establish a UN commission to explore alleged war crimes in Ukraine, and most recently 143 states in the General Assembly to condemn Russia's purported annexations. But two very high-profile states, India and China, have been among those resisting all of these moves on the grounds that we should not be forced to, quote, take sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I'll start there. So you're an expert on India's foreign policy. What's going on in India's foreign policy that makes them take this posture? Are they still trying to lead the third world? Is that part of it? Or is there something else that we should know about?
Great. Well, listen, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. I've often taught in rooms like this one, and it's fun to be back. And I hope to be teaching again one last time next fall. I think what's very difficult for countries of the developing world in this particular conflict has been to sides, and that's typified by both China and India. Now, they both clearly have a preference amongst the belligerents, but when it comes to votes at the UN, they tend to abstain. There have been 4 important votes at the UN on Ukraine. The first 2 essentially were in condemning mode of Russia. They passed overwhelmingly. There was a 3rd vote in the General Assembly on throwing China out of the Human Rights Commission, or Council, I should say, nowadays. It was less lopsided. And that's when we started to see more countries abstaining. But a bit to my surprise the other day, there was just last week, some of you may have noticed it in the media, there was another vote on Ukraine, and it was hugely lopsided, more even than the first 2. So patience seems to be running out with Russia, at least for the moment. It's a very uncomfortable position for the Russian Federation to be in, because the very few countries supporting it, Belarus being one constant, for example, are more satellites than they are fully autonomous international actors, so satellites of the Russian Federation. For China, though, I'd say it's a great dilemma. China was extremely cautious at the outset of the crisis. Clearly, it is a country that dialogues a lot with the Russian Federation. President Putin had been to visit Chairman Xi about a month before he launched his attack on Ukraine. It was widely thought that he'd sort of cleared this with President Xi, but he clearly was hoping for active support from China. That has not come. There has been no evidence whatsoever of flow of weaponry, for example, from China to Russia, whereas there is flow of weaponry from a number of other places, including Iran, to the Russian Federation. So I think China is playing its cards very cautiously. One reason may be the just concluded Great Party Conclave, which occurs every 5 years or so. But more likely, China simply wished to be extremely prudent. Ukraine's a long way away. It has a neighborhood of its own, a very different neighborhood of its own. A country like India is in effect being true to its credo of non-alignment. In the late 40s and early 50s, when the great Indian statesman Nehru became the first prime minister of India, he figured out rapidly India was just too weak to get. That economic development had to be the only project of India of any sort. And ganging together with Indonesia, Yugoslavia, and 1 or 2 other countries came up with the concept of non-alignment, which most developing countries, as they became independent, rallied to. So the membership of the non-aligned movement is a very large number, but many of its members take non-alignment rather lightly. India has always taken it quite seriously because it literally sees no advantage in aligning on any of the great powers of our day. China, the United States primarily, Russia, which is a military power, but in no other sense a major power. And so it has been true to non-alignment. What the Indian government actually thinks about all of this, I don't know. I could guess, I think, but they've been absolutely steadfast on this, which has been quite frustrating for President Biden and a bit perplexing for President Biden.
So on India, again, how would you assess the skill set of India's diplomats at the UN? We know that varies. You and I have talked about how, for example, despite it being a tiny island, Cuba's diplomats seem to be quite effective at the UN, partly because they've been there for 50 years, but never mind. But I guess the question with India is their stance with respect to Ukraine, you explain in terms of non-alignment. But do you think they have won friends along the way by taking this? Or has this hurt them as the head of what they used to call the Group of 77, now a group of what, 103 or so?
130
30.
or so. My sense of that is that no, India has not been hurt by any of this. India is developing very fast, just as China's economy seems to have been tanking. India is powering ahead. So while China's economy is nearly 5 times larger than India's, that can change over 2 or 3 decades of very fast growth in India and slow growth in China, say. And slow growth in China is a very new experience for young Chinese because China had 30 years of near miraculously high growth. And these were not tinkered statistics. They were universally accepted statistics. But I think a combination of the way the Communist Party in China dealt with COVID, which kept, putting a halt to a great deal of economic activity in China, a more assertive political stance, perhaps, which turns off a number of normally keen commercial partners of China. It may also be simply that this huge wave of growth had reached its natural ending point. We just don't know. We'll probably know a lot more in about 10 years. It takes a lot of time to figure out amongst economists, but also other disciplines, why something like economic growth slows or grows more quickly, partly because economic growth has so many components. And quick analysis is always wrong, and that's why economists are quite prudent in saying, this is why China isn't growing at all, or that is why India's done brilliantly, even through the pandemic.
So you mentioned the Great Party Congress. Now it's over. Consolidation of power seems quite clear there. So can you peek into the future and tell us what that might mean with respect to not just China's position on the Ukraine crisis, but with respect to its behavior generally at the UN?
I think on the Ukraine, China's position is unlikely to evolve. It just doesn't have a dog in the fight. Why would it? Putin so far has not been a winner, to put it politely. So why should it align on a failing vassal state as far as they're concerned? The significance, though, of Chairman Xi's renomination to a 3rd term is that Deng Xiaoping, the father of the great economic miracle of China, studiously stood down after 10 years in power. Each subsequent president did, but this president arranged to go for a 3rd term of 5 years. So this seems to betoken a significant change in which we have one-man rule in China rather than the veneer even of collective rule. And that's worrying for all sorts of people. Perhaps it shouldn't be worrying them, but Taiwan would be one. South Korea might be another. India is a 3rd because India and China had a nasty military clash up in the Himalayas about 3 years ago now. They've had these clashes in the past, but nobody got killed. They were actually fought without live weapons. They were fought with sticks and things like that to make sure nobody did get killed. This time, weapons were used, and the Chinese didn't admit to any casualties at first, but that seemed so incredible that eventually they conceded they'd had 4 killed. The Indians straight off conceded they had had 17 dead. So the relationship between China and India is quite tense, and perhaps having a possible ruler for life in China will make them tenser. We just don't know. As to India itself, it also has a very strong leader, Narendra Modi, but he engages in elections. His party loses every now and then, particularly at state level. If only the famous Congress Party were doing better at the moment, he'd be more inconvenienced. But as things are, the Congress Party have made it very easy for him to win very significant majorities whenever there is a national election. And there should be one coming up in 3 years. I'd say the only country in Asia that China really worries about is India. Why? It can't overwhelm India. It may be able to beat it in skirmishes and in actual war, but it's just too big and too populous to be overwhelmed by China, and that's a concern. Other countries, if you think back to Asian history, the last country to engage in active conflict with China was Vietnam in 1978 or 79, I think 79, because it was aggressed by China, presumably thinking that Vietnam was exhausted after the Vietnam War it had been through, but actually China got a very bloody nose. So I think it'll be a long time before China takes on Vietnam again. Taiwan is the big unknown. Clearly, Beijing worries increasingly about Taiwan. It's like an itch that it can't seem to get over. But attacking Taiwan, trying to take over Taiwan, is pregnant with risk. Even very strong countries, as Russia thought it was, can have reverses in combat, and the US has made sure that Taiwan has access to its best weaponry whenever it needs it, and that should give China some pause. The problem is for Taiwan that the US itself is a long way away. Washington's often distracted. It can't seem to juggle more than 2 or 3 balls at a time. And depending on what else is going on, it might not be rapid enough were there to be a surprise attack on Taiwan in supporting the country. So wars are always entirely unpredictable. Napoleon, when he attacked Russia, never expected to lose. It was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. So I'll stop there, but just history always advises caution, and it particularly advises caution for dictators who are surrounded by yes people. So where might they get a second opinion?
So we'll shortly turn to questions both on chat and in the room, but just one broader question. So you and I have discussed the current stance of the UN Security Council, and I think we both probably agree that it's not just a repeat of the old Cold War. Now we have 2 states that are prone to veto and to vote alike.
Mm.
Our own Catherine Williams had some perspective on the recent history of those vetoes. And so I guess I want to ask you more broadly, is the UN facing some sort of existential crisis? Do you think the Secretary General thinks there is a particular crisis that it has never confronted before? And if there is a crisis, whether it's existential or not, do you see the General Assembly actually being able to do anything under Uniting for Peace or any other way?
Well, I think the nature of the fighting is not something the UN can do anything about militarily. Were there to be a settlement down the line, the UN could monitor it, it could provide some peacekeepers, that sort of thing. But meanwhile, you're quite right that having 2 of the 5 permanent members not fully aligned, but largely aligned on Ukraine is something new. Something else that's new that nobody has really noticed is the Secretary General of the UN took a clear side during this conflict. He clearly sided with Ukraine from the very outset of the conflict, asserting that Russia's military action was aggression. Now, for a UN Secretary General, those are very strong words. His predecessors always tended towards neutrality, active neutrality, in that they were engaged in trying to negotiate an outcome. And the Secretary General and Putin go on talking to each other, and Antonio Guterres visited Moscow some time ago, about 2 months ago, I think. But it's a singular instance of a Secretary General taking a clear side. Not necessarily good news for the Russian Federation, I must say. In fact, they've had very little good news since the beginning of this conflict, including day-to-day Russian citizens who don't want to see their kids enrolled in a war that's been a very murderous war, by the way. The American media doesn't particularly emphasize casualties, but casualties have been very high on both sides.
So I'll open it up here for folks. Some are veterans of the Isle weekend, which occurred just last week, and Ukraine was strongly featured.
I'm sure.
You probably didn't go, but
I'm afraid not.
There was a proposal for an international tribunal on aggression to be created by the General Assembly. There is the regular proposals to reform the Security Council veto power so that you cannot vote or veto any resolution dealing with, say, aggression or a number of war crimes. So some of them may have, I'm just teeing up questions, folks, on those, but now's your chance to ask one of the leading people who knows the UN inside and out.
And one Asian country I haven't mentioned so far, one that José works on actually, is Japan, and it's a major player. So if any of you have questions on where Japan fits in and how it views all of this, delighted to respond.
Yes, please.
So I have a question about 5 Asian countries that are not Japan. So I think an abstention vote kind of contains multitudes and probably says a lot, and different abstentions mean different things. So I'm particularly interested in what you think about what India might be trying to communicate with an abstain vote versus, for example, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, the former Central Asian Soviet countries, who are also abstaining as a bloc, are also, I think, now members of the non-aligned movement, but I think are trying to say something different. And I'm wondering, how you think the incentives to or messages from abstentions differ across countries.
I think India is simply being faithful to its long-standing foreign policy. While Mr. Modi's domestic policy is very different, his approach to politics is very different from everything that preceded him. under his own party, or more usually in the past, the Congress party. On foreign policy, he's been entirely consistent with Nehruvian foreign policy. So I'd say the Indian veto, the Indian abstention should be no surprise whatsoever. I think at first, for countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, who do have meaningful relationships with both China and the Russian Federation, they were in a very difficult position. But once they saw China increasingly not engaging actively with Russia on the Ukraine, made it much easier for them to abstain in these votes. So I think Russia's spectacular failure has been to attract respectable company of any sort in this venture.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for convening this. It's extremely interesting and of course very topical. I had a question regarding about China's negotiations at the UN in terms of multilateral fora in general, or but mostly at the UN, versus its stance towards its own population inside, like outwards and inwards. I'm referring to, I only know China's kind of activities at the first committee and the third committee on cyber discussions. And it seems to be that China there is trying to like come across like China has its own opinion, but they seem to come across as often like trying to be harmonious and trying to show, you know, we are a good player at the international stage. But at the same time, they're very restrictive, or at least that's what appears to be what we hear from the media towards its own population and its own, you know, sovereignty and internet, etc. So I'm wondering what
well, I'm very glad you raised these points, because China, first of all, has an exceptionally well-trained foreign service, a very professional one. And its members tend to specialize. They don't always specialize, and they do tend to accept foreign postings in different parts of the world, but you can nearly always see a leitmotif in a Chinese diplomatic career. And in particular, in multilateral organizations, notably the UN, not always, but very often, their diplomats have served multiple times. So they're quite experienced, unlike the diplomats of many other countries. And Russia is very similar. It has real experts on the UN. In fact, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, until he became foreign minister, had spent his whole career on the UN. He had done nothing else. So China and Russia have a certain model, and most countries in the world prefer training generalists who are versatile, who can move from one place to another. Now, the fact that the Chinese and Russians are highly specialized by and large also means that they know the rule book and they know the precedents at the UN much better than other diplomats do. So you'd want to study up very hard before you took on Sergei Lavrov on points of precedent or regulation of the UN system, because he would almost certainly outclass you. That would not necessarily be the case with, say, a Canadian diplomat being Canadian. We often start at zero knowledge on day one of an assignment and then learn on the job, which is fun, but not necessarily as effective as the Chinese and Russian approach.
So let me take you up on the Japan. So what is Japan's posture? How effective is it?
Well, I think Japan, as its economy has stagnated over the last 30 years, it's still a very significant economy, but 30 years without much growth eventually reduces the weight of a country if countries around it are growing, the relative weight of a country. So this has been a foreign policy challenge also for Japan, which is a deft foreign policy actor. It has very few enemies. It has friends, but it no longer has the means to be super generous the way it was in the past. The Japanese aid program is vanishingly small per capita, and most of it goes to subsidizing the concessional part of loans of interest to Japanese companies in the developing world. So Japan has today a very atrophied aid program. But it's a popular country in the developing world. It's never a country that's telling people what to do. It's a good listener. Its technical expertise is valued all over the world, including in the US and Canada. All of these things are assets, but what isn't an asset is 30 years of stagnation. Now, what that has led Japan to do, particularly under its recently and very bizarrely assassinated Prime Minister Abe, was to be a bit more strategic and look for allies in Asia. So which are the countries in Asia that have weight? China, first and foremost, because it has economic weight as well as geostrategic weight, but right behind it, India. And India and Japan have always had polite, mutually respectful relationship. There are a number of Buddhists in Japan. There are, the cultures are very copacetic, so to say. But economically and socially, the countries are at huge variance. Several earlier Japanese prime ministers had tried to establish a more organic and substantive relationship with India and failed because Japanese corporations just wouldn't, play along. But Mr. Abe, who's probably Japan's strongest, some thought even dictatorial prime minister in many decades, decided actually India had to be Japan's key partner in Asia. There are others like Indonesia, which is a country of very significant weight, which works hard to attract no attention to itself. But when you have as large a population and as rapidly growing an economy as Indonesia, you're going to be very significant. But Abe really courted India, both under Prime Minister Singh and then Prime Minister Modi, and was pretty successful. But his successors have failed to follow up credibly. This is typical of Japanese politics, I'm afraid. And also for the Japanese, who are so punctilious in business, who expect every I to be dotted, every T to be crossed, and every commitment to be met, India is a puzzle, and that remains true today. Just to give you a practical illustration, the flagship project of Modi and Abe was to create together a high-speed rail line between two Indian cities, Mumbai and Ahmedabad, Mr. Modi's city. And this seemed a slam dunk because Korea has created fantastic subway systems in Japan. So why wouldn't Japan create fantastic fast rail line? But actually it's run into the sands, the project, for reasons that are hugely frustrating for the Japanese, but very routine reasons in India. What happened as soon as people owning land roughly on the route between Mumbai and Ahmedabad became aware of the project, they stopped selling their land and the land started becoming more valuable. The land is now so valuable that the Japanese are balking at the price they would need to pay. Very, very typical of India, but nobody in Japan had thought of this, and Mr. Modi hadn't mentioned the possibility to his good friend, Mr. Abe. So it's something the Indian Parliament could deal with by adopting a law, an eminent domain law, for example, but he hasn't, interestingly. So the Japanese are stuck and very frustrated at this point.
So we've started to get some questions from the chat box, and this is for sort of in the way of advice. Given we understand what your position is, or India's position, given its dependence on both Russia for military supplies and the US for trade, but what should India use as its voice? That is, if you were advising the Indian government to be more effective, either at the UN or more generally, what would you tell?
Well, I'd tell India to be more patient with something that's a universal fact. Washington has an incredibly short attention span. As I mentioned earlier, it can deal with about 3 issues at once and no more. And that's just a fact. So expecting Washington to always be there for you and, you know, working Congress so that whatever India wants eventually happen is just not Washington at all. So that's a huge frustration on the Indian side. On the American side, there is a puzzlement because after the nuclear deal was successfully negotiated, in which Washington would remove its objection to the export of nuclear technologies to India, which had been an international regime. I think the Indians had expected everything would be fine with Congress and so on. And the Americans had expected that they could now flood India with American products. Wrong. They have to compete in India. Why make any special favors when it's quite a poor country still to a partner like the United States? Let them compete. And one of the reasons that India buys most of its weaponry from Russia is it's so much cheaper than Western weaponry, even West European weaponry. So it's a financial thing. But there are weapons that, particularly aircraft, that India would like to have from the United States, but that hasn't seemed to happen one way or the other. So there's a mutual frustration at this point. If I was advising them, I'd say, you know, focus a bit more on the relationship. Don't let yourselves get distracted by the latest YouTube video, because this is a meaningful engagement, a globally meaningful engagement, just as for Japan, the engagement with India is an absolutely critical relationship. But it might fall on deaf ears.
So want to turn around and ask, what should Biden be doing better, or is that just too difficult?
I think it's just very difficult in Washington because Washington is a relentlessly transactional town. And long-term projects other than, say, NASA long-term projects or vaccine long-term projects, more technical projects, they are supported over the long term, clearly, in a consensus between successive administrations and Congress. But anything with immediate political overtones runs into great difficulty under any president, in Congress. And while actually, if you think of it, the current Senate has been a great deal more cooperative with President Biden than any of us would have expected, or at least I would have expected. There's a limit to how far Senator McConnell is going to go, I think.
Well, and if Congress changes hands, there's a limit of how
Indeed.
much aid's going to come
Mhm.
back to Ukraine. So
Indeed.
there is a question from one of our former students.
Oh, terrific.
And in that class, I think we stressed the long-term aspects of Security Council reform. I believe you called it the never-ending committee as opposed to the long-standing committee on UN reform. And so the students asking, well, given Biden's speech was vaguely hopeful on the prospects of expanding the Security Council and other things, is there any realistic prospect for serious Security Council reform, not just about expansion, but about its procedures, about the veto? Anything likely there, or is it just the same as usual?
I think not, because anything put forward, sorry to be so blunt, can be vetoed by any of the permanent 5 members. So as each of them has a veto, and as frankly, none of them are really keen on new permanent members. I have yet to have a private conversation with delegates from any of those countries in which they express rapture at the concept of sharing power in any way in the council beyond being polite to the non-permanent members. I think actually it's going to take a collapse of the UN system and something else emerging. Now, the UN system, it's important to think about, is 75 years old. Most internationalizations do not last 75 years. There are a couple that date back to the mid-19th century, the International Telecommunications Union and the Postal Organization, which increasingly looks as if it may be out of business at some point. But most international organizations collapse under their own weight or irrelevance after a number of years. And this should be worrying the UN.
Your third edition is going to look a little different.
So I'd say important as it is in all sorts of ways, it's not with us forever unless it can perform on the most important challenges, many of which are peace and security challenges. Now, it can come together on the conflicts of Africa, and mostly does, particularly when there's a clear cue from the African Union, the regional organization of Africa, of what they think the Security Council should be deciding. And occasionally in the Middle East, there will be the possibility of some coming together, for example, on a conflict like Yemen. But I'd say overwhelmingly on geostrategically relevant files, there's been a breakdown in relationships today.
Would you describe the Security Council as paralyzed, or is that too?
No, I think it's too strong because it goes file by file. So, for example, on a country like Haiti, if those countries most interested in Haiti could come up with a plan and present it to the UN on what to do, I think that plan would probably be adopted. But for the moment, the countries most interested in Haiti are being rather cautious. You will have seen out of Washington an openness to peacekeeping that sounded like America might even join and lead, but that's not yet being
in Haiti, you said.
In Haiti, which would be a second time for the United States, but they haven't made any attempt to operationalize these ideas at the UN or anywhere else that I'm aware of. So there's no doubt the country is in a huge mess and the population is suffering, but it's a country that's been in a huge mess for about 200 years with brief intervals of rational leadership. And so Latin America finds it very difficult to consider anything about Haiti super urgent. The reason the US finds Haiti at times super urgent is it fears waves of migrants coming to the US. It's very self-interested. It's interested in stability in Haiti.
Well, when somebody like you says that organizations don't tend to last for more than 75 years, that gets my attention. So it's clear that there is a considerable backlash on the UN's entire human rights system. That is, naming and shaming states, even at the General Assembly, now gets some 30 states opposing generally any naming and shaming. In the UN Human Rights Council, we see China trying to redefine what a democracy is, what a human rights defender is, in all sorts of ways. So on human rights, which is a good chunk of what the UN is now doing, is there maybe the better idea is to go with something like Biden's League of Democracies, that some of which might actually believe in human rights, rather than trying these forums where, because it's the authoritarians are actually in the room making the norm, are ineffective.
No, I don't think the Human Rights Council is out of gas. What is out of gas is journalists covering it systematically and well. So when there's something involving China, of course, all the media stringers in Geneva come running. But if it's something involving women's rights, for example, or gay rights, or something more generic of that sort, gets absolutely zero coverage. So I'd say there's attention deficit disorder amongst the very small press corps in Geneva covering the UN in Geneva. And the size of the press corps covering the UN in New York has shrunk hugely as papers go bankrupt. And, there's been a huge consolidation of media, economic consolidation of media over the last 30 years.
So does the UN have too few or too many or too much in terms of resources? Does it need more money or less money to be more efficient?
I think it needs a minimum of money to be efficient at all. I think what it is a system that's too sprawling. It's tentacular. There's an agency for nearly everything. These agencies don't always cooperate well with each other. It often depends on the respective leaderships of agencies. How the UN plays with other important multilateral organizations, World Bank, IMF, regional development banks, European Union, so on. This has been very up and down, and the UN is partly responsible for that. So unless the UN can learn to be a more systematically engaged and positive player vis-a-vis these other organizations, rather than thinking of itself as all important, which is the worst way for any of us as human beings or, as organizations to think of ourselves, would be nice. Unfortunately, the UN collectively does often think of itself as being at the heart of international relations, as if that achieves anything in and of itself.
Questions more from the floor?
Yes, it's been said that now after the invasion of Ukraine, we're starting a new time in international law. It's been said, and I want to know what your views regarding the economic perspective, because as you were mentioning, Japan, it was leading the TPP-11, and at the same time, you have China with its Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think that the war in Ukraine pushed forward any of those two economic ordering projects, or it doesn't impact in the terms of economic project?
Very personal opinion. I think it has zero impact on either of them. TPP without the United States is a different TPP. It's a huge loss for the United States and a huge loss for TPP. I do think Biden was wise not to rejoin immediately, because then having the next Republican president withdraw is just more, disruption. But it shows how hyper politicized everything became under Trump. But TPP 11 is meaningful for its member states. China's principal equivalent of something like TPP wouldn't be the Belt and Road Initiative, I would argue. It would be more the group bringing together the Central Asian countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. It's so far just a talk shop, but I think that's a meaningful grouping potentially, because they do constitute a region of a sort. But so far, the chat has been largely hollow.
Other questions?
As I think about so many of the challenges you were discussing before, I cannot stop thinking about domestic politics. I come from Brazil. I have been living in the United Kingdom, and I visit the US often. I was here when Trump was elected. So it feels like the three countries that I have had the most to do with in my life have gotten on this kind of crazy political overdrive.
It must be you must be a jinx.
Maybe it's me. Yeah, I have to investigate the possibility. Actually, but what do they have in common?
Mhm.
And then, but something that I have been thinking about is how in times of deep political turmoil domestically, what kind of room is there to even contemplate the international sphere, but also international organizations in particular? I have always been a massive supporter of international organizations, but it is very difficult to sell them to people. You describe Washington, D.C. as very transactional, and you are so right about that. But the kind of currency that international organizations or those kind of initiatives tend to enjoy in such transactions tends to be zero. And I was just wondering, what do you make of this attempt to do these things, while people, if you were to ask them, might say misguidedly, no, this is not what we want other things.
Well, I think for publics, they don't think about international relations very much. That would be the same in Ghana as it is in the United States or Canada. It's just not top of the line unless there's a huge crisis. Much more local concerns all over the world are generally top of the line, and domestic politics, where domestic politics is relevant. In a country as big as India, for example, international relations take up very limited bandwidth overall in the media, and it's quite a diverse media in the country, and India is a hugely diverse country. I think what's been falling apart in recent years is an ability of the apparats in each country focusing on foreign policy, defense policy, and other related policy areas. Could be include intelligence and finance, for example, is to be connecting the dots constantly. That doesn't seem to be going on in capital. So it isn't just Washington. President Putin was clearly very out of touch with global realities when he launched his Ukraine war. And I think the Chinese have a worry they may be out of touch. They work very hard on not being out of touch, but unlike many other countries, but there's this worry they may not fully understand the rest of the world. So that's a given nearly everywhere now, especially with the diffusion of information, an overload of trivia as well as interesting facts on the internet and interesting discussions. There's endless garbage also. So it's hard to say that the net has helped us a great deal in international relations, quite the contrary, in my view.
So on the Q&A box, asks the fundamental question: the UN was established to prevent, especially interstate aggression. Many of us have said, well, at least it's done that. That is, most of the time it's been civil conflicts that it has not been able to do. But now you get a pretty big state doing something that looks very much like aggression, and it happens to be a member of the P5. So has the UN now reached an impasse on a fundamental reason for being? Collective security to prevent interstate aggression? Or is this just a blip and it will be able to contain interstate aggression in other places?
But that's a black and white question, and the situation is gray. As I was mentioning, in Africa, the UN is, when it works together with the African Union, and there are sub-regional organizations also in Africa with the sub-regional organization involved, it can be quite effective. In the Middle East, at times, it can be very helpful. In the Americas, largely because Latin American countries don't like involvement of the rest of the world in Latin American affairs, there's less scope, I'd say, for the UN, although it did play an important role in resolving some very nasty Central American problems about 30 years ago, and in helping alleviate and temporarily resolve problems in places like Haiti. So I think these sweeping judgments, is the UN totally useless, or is it, you know, akin to God? Very difficult to answer in yes and no, in fact, be foolish.
So another question that came in is, what lessons, you mentioned Taiwan, what lessons do you think China is getting from Ukraine? Because one view would be that it's drawing, hey, don't go there, because look what happens. It isn't as easy as you think to take over a region that thinks of itself as independent. What do you think the Chinese are getting from this?
I have no idea. They have doubtless noticed the extent of political support in Washington for Taiwan that Nancy Pelosi brought into sharp focus recently with her visit to the country, which was something nobody as senior as her had done in a very
Was that a mistake?
time. No, I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was an awkward moment for the president because he got hijacked, but you know.
Right, but he said we could put troops on the ground.
Indeed, and that's another message to China. China's best bet would be to hope it could overwhelm nearly instantly Taiwan, but that's highly unlikely because there's already a great deal of sophisticated weaponry in Taiwan. So Hong Kong and Taiwan are very different propositions. It's much easier to defend an island than to defend a small territory with a very long land border with the country interested in overwhelming it. So I'd say it would be a very risky venture, not just a risky one, but it may be that the chairman decides to do it because Taiwan has been a real irritant for the Chinese Communist Party, and in recent years, perhaps more of an irritant than earlier. Now, Japan would instantly get involved. Japan doesn't have armed forces. It has very well-equipped so-called self-defense forces and very well-trained self-defense forces. In and of itself, Japan could not take on single-handedly China and hope to win, but Japan the United States, India failing to be helpful in any way, or perhaps being somehow unhelpful in some way. All of this should worry China quite a lot. China's short of real friends. That's its problem.
Well, I don't know if I want to end there, but that's where we are ending up because we have another tradition of ending on time.
A
Help me thank,
wonderful tradition.
thank Dave.
Now, I do need to say on the record that I'm talking here as an academic. I'm not talking as a UN official at all, and I've been extremely frank, so please don't go off tweeting all of this.
On that one.
It'd be a waste of your efforts. Nobody reads tweets anymore. It's the most outdated way of communicating, I'd have to say.
Yeah, we're turning this into a TikTok video.
So that might be more effective. So please respect my honesty with you and do not quote me out of context.
Thank you, Dave.